admire towering historical figures, we look at their conquests.
Right, the public stuff.
Exactly. You open a history book, and greatness is almost always quantified by, like, the borders they moved or the empires they built. It's very much like looking at a map. It's black and white, it's rigid, and it's entirely external.
Yeah, because it's the easiest way for historians to categorize influence, you know? We
Hmm.
default to the sheer volume of public achievement simply because it's measurable.
Right, but when you look at the source material we are diving into today, the map just isn't enough. Not even close.
No, it really isn't.
Today, we are taking a deep dive into an absolutely monumental lecture series titled Life of Prophet Muhammad, the legacy of the greatest man who ever lived. And our mission today is to show you why that title is so accurate.
Yeah, because what becomes immediately clear when you go through this material is that we are looking at a legacy built not just on massive public achievements, but on a staggering emotional and spiritual depth.
It's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
It completely redefines what it means to leave a mark on humanity.
Right. It really does. The series frames his life as just deeply awe-inspiring because those public triumphs are entirely rooted in his private character.
So we aren't just going to list off dates or, historical events today.
No, to really convey the awe and sentiment these accounts carry, we're going to examine 4 distinct facets of his life.
Okay, lay it out for us.
We're going to look at his devoted partnership as a husband, his strategic compassion as a statesman, his highly calculated genius as a peacemaker, and finally, his profound pursuit of spiritual solitude.
I love that. Let's jump right into the private life. Because to understand the public statesman, you really have to understand the private heart.
You absolutely do.
And that brings us to his first marriage, which when you look at the socioeconomic context of 7th century Mecca, it completely shattered the expectations of the time.
Oh, it defied every single societal norm you can think of.
Right, because Mecca wasn't just some quiet, sleepy desert town.
Not at all. It was a hyper-competitive, bustling trade hub. I mean, it was a fiercely capitalist society where your status, your lineage, and your wealth meant absolutely everything.
Which sets the stage perfectly for Khadija.
Yeah.
I mean, picture this. Khadija is a 40-year-old, incredibly wealthy, highly respected noble widow.
She was a powerhouse.
Exactly. She is essentially a business mogul.
Yes.
She manages these massive trade caravans that travel all the way up to Syria and down to Yemen.
And in that kind of cutthroat environment, absolute honesty is a premium commodity. She needed someone she could trust not to, skim off the top.
Right. She hears about this 25-year-old guy named Muhammad, who literally has a local reputation as the truthful.
Yeah, his integrity was already legendary locally.
So she hires him. He takes her goods on this long trading journey, accompanied by her servant, a man named Maysara.
And when they return, the profits are just unprecedented. But more importantly, Maysara is glowing with praise about his character.
Yeah, how he conducted himself on the road. And this is where the narrative really flips, because Khadija is the one who initiates the proposal to him.
Which is such a massive detail.
It is. And I want to pause here because, we need to put this into perspective for you. Even today, a wealthy, powerful 40-year-old female CEO proposing to her 25-year-old employee would make headlines.
Oh, absolutely.
He's 25. He's from the noble Banu Hashim clan. He realistically could have married any young woman in Mecca to build traditional alliances. So why her?
Well, according to the accounts, it tells us his core values were completely detached from those superficial tribal expectations.
He wasn't playing the political game.
Exactly. He wasn't looking for political leverage. He recognized her intellect, her character, and her strength. So he accepts the proposal, and what follows is this incredible, unmatched display of emotional loyalty.
Yeah, for the next 25 years.
Right, 25 years. The absolute prime of his youth, from age 25 to 50, he remains married solely to Khadija.
Which, again, is wildly unconventional. In a tribal society where multiple marriages were the standard method for men to build wealth and alliances, he stays fiercely monogamous.
And they build a profoundly deep spiritual partnership. She was really his anchor.
Yeah, the sources emphasize how when he received his first revelations and was terrified, she was the first person to believe in him.
Even when the rest of his society eventually turned against him, she was there.
The emotional resonance of that is just staggering. And you see it play out decades later, right? Years after Khadija passes away, he would still slaughter a sheep just to send the meat to her friends.
Because he was keeping those emotional ties alive.
Yeah, and there's this famously moving account where his later wife, Aisha, who is young and understandably feeling A bit of retrospective jealousy.
Sure, very human reaction.
Right. She asks him why he constantly talks about this older woman who passed away. She essentially says, didn't God give you someone better?
And the sources note that he became legitimately upset by that.
He defended her memory so fiercely.
He did. He told Aisha, no, by Allah, he did not replace me with anyone better. Because she had faith in me when the people rejected me. She believed me when the people belied me.
Wow.
And the key phrase he uses is that Allah had firmly planted Khadijah's love in his heart.
So it wasn't framed as just a youthful romance.
Not at all. It was a foundational pillar of his emotional survival. He was fiercely, unapologetically loyal to the woman who stood by him in the dark.
Which naturally brings up a really genuine question. And I know you, listening to this, might be thinking the exact same thing I did when I first went through this material.
Right, the shift later in life.
Exactly. If he was the absolute poster child for fierce, monogamous devotion until the age of 50, why the sudden shift? He passes away, leaving behind 9 widows.
Yeah, on paper, to a modern reader, that looks like a massive contradiction.
Critics point this out constantly. So how do the historical texts reconcile this?
It's probably the most heavily scrutinized aspect of his life. But when you look at the mechanics of statecraft in 7th century Arabia, it makes perfect sense.
Because his role completely changed.
Right. After the age of 50, his life shifted from being a private merchant to the leader of a newly formed, heavily persecuted religious state.
Right, and in a tribal world without formal embassies or signed treaties.
Marriages were the embassies. They were the highest form of diplomacy and caregiving.
Okay, but let's pressure test that because I want to look at a specific example to make it real for you. Let's talk about Habiba.
That is a perfect example.
He marries Habiba, who happens to be the daughter of Abu Sufyan. And Abu Sufyan isn't just a casual opponent.
No, he is the fiercest enemy of early Islam.
Right, he's the leader of the Meccan opposition actively fighting the Muslims. So I struggle to see how marrying the daughter of your archenemy doesn't just look like a political hostage situation.
It's a really fair question. But the context of where Habiba actually was at the time changes everything. She wasn't captured in battle.
Okay.
She had actually converted to Islam early on, and she fled to Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia, to escape persecution from her own father's people.
Oh, wow. So she was completely estranged from her father.
Exactly. And her husband then passed away there, leaving her totally stranded, widowed, and isolated hundreds of miles from home.
That's heartbreaking.
So the prophet sent an envoy to the king of Abyssinia to propose to her, purely to protect her and honor her faith.
Wow. Okay, so it was actually an act of rescue.
Yes, but here is the diplomatic genius of the era. When Abu Sufyan heard that the leader of the Muslims married his daughter rather than being furious, the tribal code of honor kicked in.
He was actually proud of the match, wasn't he?
He was, because of Muhammad's noble lineage. It brilliantly softened Abu Sufyan's stance and chipped away at the bitter hostility between the two camps. It bridged a massive psychological divide.
So it's literal diplomacy through empathy and family ties.
Precisely. And we see this with others, too. He marries Sauda, an older widow in desperate need of care.
And Juwayriya, right? Which directly results in her entire previously hostile tribe embracing Islam because they were now considered family.
Exactly. He also marries the daughters of his 2 closest companions, Abu Bakr and Umar, which cemented their brotherhood.
But beyond statecraft, the sources bring up a mechanism that I found totally fascinating. The preservation of the legacy itself, the Sunnah.
Yes, the Sunnah, which is the recorded example of the Prophet's life. It is the second foundational source of Islamic law after the Quran.
Now think about the logistical problem of historical preservation in an oral society.
It's massive.
There were thousands of companions who could document his public life, right? How he commanded an army, how he judged a public dispute.
But who on earth could verify how he acted in his private life?
You would need someone inside the house.
You'd need multiple people inside the house. You need to know how he treated his family, how he maintained his hygiene, how he prayed in the middle of the night.
Because if he only had one wife, any political rival in the centuries to come could just discredit her.
Right, they could claim she was biased or argue that her memory faded over time.
Because human memory is fallible. So the early Muslim community developed this rigorous peer review system, basically.
Yeah, they developed chains of narration called the isnad. To verify a historical fact, you needed multiple independent data points corroborating the exact same event.
That is so smart.
By having multiple wives, the community had multiple verifiable independent witnesses from inside the inner sanctum. It was a massive, historically necessary mechanism to preserve the intricate details of the faith.
And that brings us to the case of Aisha, which is definitely the most talked about and the most targeted by critics today.
Oh, without a doubt.
But when you look at her actual impact on the preservation of history, it's just undeniable.
Absolutely. The sources present this marriage as divinely instructed, revealed through a dream, but the functional outcome of this marriage was completely revolutionary for Islamic scholarship.
Because of her personality, right? Aisha had this exceptionally brilliant, inquisitive mind.
She was a genius in her own right.
Yeah, and the senior companions, the older men who fought alongside him, they revered him so deeply they would barely look him in the eye out of respect.
They were terrified of overstepping by asking too many questions.
But Aisha was young, and she had a deeply playful, intimate dynamic with him.
She had absolutely no inhibition about challenging him intellectually. If he made a theological statement, she was the one who would ask, wait, why?
She pushed for the underlying logic.
Exactly. She would demand clarification on the rulings.
And because she pushed, she essentially became the bridge of knowledge for the entire civilization. She ranks as the fourth highest narrator of hadith in Islamic history.
With over 2,200 narrations.
That is incredible. Every major school of thought relies on her rigorous questioning. By marrying someone with that specific psychological makeup, he institutionalized a culture of questioning and scholarship.
It was a perfectly designed dynamic. So if we step back, we see this incredible emotional intelligence dedicated to maintaining peace and preserving knowledge in his household.
Which makes perfect sense when you look at his public policy. If he was that deeply invested in the emotional realities of his private life, his approach to societal leadership was driven by that exact same psychology.
Completely.
Which explains the, frankly, bizarre way he handled the Kaaba crisis. Let's talk about the genius peacemaker.
This is a remarkable event that takes place before his prophethood, when he's about 35 years old.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So the Kaaba in Mecca, the sacred cubic structure originally built by the prophet Abraham, and which the sources say traces its deepest foundations back to Adam, it had been severely damaged by a massive flood.
And the Quraysh tribes realize they have to rebuild it. But they revere this building so much, they're literally terrified to even swing a hammer at the damaged walls.
Right, they thought they might be cursed.
And when they finally do, they make a strict pact.
Yeah.
They will only use pure, ethically sourced money to fund the reconstruction.
No money from usury, no money earned through oppression or prostitution.
They even salvage wood from a Roman ship that had smashed against the rocks in the Red Sea nearby. But because their funding criteria was so unbelievably strict, they actually ran out of money.
Yeah, they had to make the building slightly smaller than its original Abrahamic footprint, leaving a semicircular area outside the main walls.
But the architecture wasn't the crisis, was it?
No, the crisis was the black stone.
Right, so the walls are up, and it's time to place the sacred black stone back into its corner.
And this stone is deeply, deeply revered. The traditions state it originated from paradise.
And suddenly, all progress just stops. Every single tribe realizes that whoever physically places this stone will hold the ultimate honor and political leverage in Mecca for generations.
And this wasn't a polite boardroom disagreement. The tension escalates to terrifying levels.
I mean, the sources describe one tribe bringing out a bowl full of blood.
Yes, tribal leaders start plunging their hands into this blood, swearing a solemn oath to fight to the absolute death over this honor.
For days, construction is halted. You have a full-blown medieval battle royale brewing over a rock.
It's the ultimate powder keg.
Finally, the oldest man in the city suggests a compromise. He says, look, we're going to let the very next man who walks into the sacred precinct be the judge.
Which honestly is the ultimate delegation of responsibility.
They are literally leaving a civil war up to random chance.
But the crowd agrees. They hold their breath watching the entrance, and the man who walks in is Muhammad.
And the accounts say a wave of relief washed over the crowd. They immediately started shouting, "The truthful and trustworthy, we accept him."
But let's analyze the trap he just walked into.
It is such a trap. If he chooses his own plan, the Banu Harashim, everyone accuses him of bias, and war breaks out.
Right. And if he chooses the strongest tribe to appease them, the weaker tribes form a coalition, and war breaks out.
It is an impossible, no-win diplomatic nightmare. How on earth does he solve it?
With a legendary stroke of psychological genius, he doesn't choose a tribe. He asks for a large piece of cloth. He takes the black stone and places it right in the center of the fabric.
Wow.
Then he commands a representative from every single rival tribe to take hold of the edge of the cloth.
So they're all physically operating as equals.
Exactly. Together, they lift the stone to the proper height on the wall. And then, with his own hands, he slides it into its final resting place.
It's so brilliantly simple. He decentralized the honor.
He gave everyone the prestige of lifting it, which dissolved the threat of war instantly.
It's the ultimate masterclass in unification.
It really is. And what's fascinating is how this profound empathy for human nature played out decades later.
Oh, when he conquers Mecca.
Yes. Towards the end of his life, he returns to Mecca as a conqueror. He now has the ultimate authority, the manpower, and the funds to rebuild the Kaaba to its massive, original Abrahamic foundations.
Right, to include that semicircular area they had to leave out and to add 2 ground-level doors the way Abraham designed it.
Exactly. He has the budget now.
So why wouldn't he make the most sacred site structurally perfect?
Because he recognized the psychology of his people. He told Aisha that the Meccan's faith was still new, it was soft, they had just recently accepted Islam.
Right.
If he came in and immediately started demolishing and fundamentally altering the architecture of their most sacred site, the psychological shock might shatter their fragile new faith.
Wow.
He chose to leave the building structurally imperfect to protect the spiritual stability of the people.
That is, man, think about that. It's like moving a patient out of the ICU. You don't immediately make them run a marathon just because running is technically good for the human body.
This shock would literally kill them.
Exactly. He treated their faith like a recovering patient. Sometimes executing the procedurally correct thing is the absolute wrong thing to do psychologically.
Precisely. It shows immense restraint. He prioritized the emotional readiness of the community over a monumental physical legacy.
So we have this flawless diplomatic instinct. We have this unwavering loyalty to Khadija, this incredible emotional restraint with the Kaaba.
Right.
But here is the ultimate question. Where does a human being develop that? How does a mind get tempered to process high-stakes conflict with such absolute calm?
Well, the sources point to one very specific mechanism: profound intentional solitude.
Let's talk about the Cave of Hira.
Yeah, we're talking about his time in this cave. Even years before his prophethood began, he would regularly leave the bustling, noisy, highly social environment of Mecca.
To just be alone.
He would hike up a mountain a few kilometers away and spend days, sometimes weeks, completely alone in a tiny cave, just looking out at the Kaaba in the distance.
Think about your own life for a second. We are constantly immersed in noise. Group chats, social media, endless streams of opinions, societal expectations.
It's overwhelming.
Most people are terrified of sitting alone in a quiet room for 20 minutes, let alone days on a mountain. What the sources are modeling here is the absolute fundamental necessity of disconnecting.
The theological and psychological texts explain this beautifully. They state that too much socialization, too much attachment to the material world, what they refer to as the dunya, it actually creates a veil over the human heart.
It obscures your vision.
It feeds the ego, because when you are constantly around people, you are constantly performing. To strip away that ego and develop raw, uncompromising sincerity, you have to experience solitude between you and the Creator.
But, he wasn't advocating for everyone to become ascetic monks in the desert.
No. And that is the crucial balance of his legacy. He modeled the perfect middle path.
Right.
He was deeply immersed in the mud of human society, leading armies, negotiating treaties, dredging civil disputes, caring for orphans.
He always maintained a mechanism for solitude.
Always. Whether it was retreating to the cave in his early years or later in life, waking up in the deep, quiet hours of the night to pray while the rest of the city slept, he constantly recalibrated his internal compass.
So let's bring all of this together. We started by looking at a map, right? Measuring greatness by external conquests.
Yeah.
But what we've seen today in this deep dive is the legacy of a man whose greatness was fundamentally internal.
Completely.
We saw a husband whose loyalty defied the capitalist tribal norms of his youth. We saw a statesman whose later marriages weren't contradictions, but calculated diplomatic life raft that forged a unified community.
And created the peer review mechanism through brilliant scholars like Aisha to preserve his legacy forever.
Exactly. We saw a peacemaker whose emotional intelligence stopped a tribal bloodbath over a stone. And underneath all of that public brilliance We found a soul forged in the quiet isolation of a mountain cave.
It is a profound synthesis. It shows that public triumphs are completely hollow if they aren't anchored by private virtue.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating thought to walk away with. We look at modern leaders today,
Yeah.
politicians, CEOs, movement builders.
Sure.
They have all the technology in the world to record their public achievements. But so many of them fail to leave a lasting, multi-generational legacy because they lack the two things we just talked about. They lack the trusted internal validators, like the scholars in his household, to translate their private character into a lasting model. And more importantly, they're so hyper-connected to the noise of the crowd, they completely lack a mechanism for deep solitude.
That's a powerful realization.
It makes you wonder, in our modern digital age, what profound truths about your own life, your own character, and your own legacy are you failing to preserve simply because you haven't figured out how to disconnect and find your own cave? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.